Thank you. A really warm thank you to the organizers of this wonderful conference. And not only is it wonderful being here, meeting colleagues, but also for the very, very important topic and theme for the whole conference, which I think is sort of close to all our hearts, and without which I think probably our work is rather pointless. So in recent decades, there also been a lot of pressure for archives to democratize and to be opened up. And it's also shown in the role of the archivist, sort of being portrayed as this gatekeeper to becoming a facilitator in many ways. And then, of course, as you all know, we also have things sort of pushing back to the openness in terms of GDPR and, copyright issues. And then something that's sort of very obvious through I think, most of the presentations here, all the digital development and digital solutions that are making it possible to access archive material at a previously unconceivable scale. So it's little wonder then that digitization and digital products tend to be the go-to solution for access to archive material. And this is very much the case at the archive I work at, which is the archives of the Society of Swedish Literature in Finland. It's a bit of a mouthful. And I work more specifically at the collections of language and tradition. So I wanted to focus a bit on a slightly different aspect of access here, or accessibility, namely community contacts and participation in knowledge production. And I'm fully aware here that for a lot of archives this is a bit of a non-issue, because you already have all the sort of prerequisites, the practices, initiatives and traditions of having this covered. But my archive is sort of balancing a bit between being a kind of national institutional archive and a community archive. So I think it's something that we need to remind ourselves about. And indeed, it's been one of the wonderful things and the privilege of being part of this type of international archive network, to be able to learn from all the fantastic projects, community projects, crowdsourcing projects, just like Lina presented here just recently, and sort of take inspiration and hope from them. But my presentation then is very much from the perspective of the archives of Swedish literature in Finland. And I'll start with a short background, and then I'll try to look at how folk culture documentation have, during these different time periods in the early 1900s, in the mid 1900s and today, have had additional benefits for the tradition archives beyond simply adding individual items to the archive collection. Now, why is there a Swedish literature archive in Finland, you may well ask? Well, it's very shortly. There's been a Swedish-speaking minority in Finland since, well, at least the 1100s. And very importantly, this minority has always consisted both of sort of lower class or population and upper classes, and there were no contact between these groups. There were no sense of common Swedish-speaking identity in the area that is today Finland. It was only in sort of the late 19th century that it became desirable to create some kind of common identity. And this was very much then in order to make the claim in this sort of proto-nation building process of Finland, to make the claim that Swedish-speaking culture was indeed part of Finnish national culture. And here, to create this kind of sense of common identity, the whole national, or sort of the whole interest in folklore and folk culture during the 1800s was a huge help. And this indeed was to become the adhesive, the glue that somehow made it possible for this consolidation process to take place. So consequently, when the Society of Swedish Literature in Finland was founded in 1885, it's not surprising to find then that folklore collection was sort of very high up on the agenda already. And the Swedish Literature Society in Finland, of course, was modeled on the Finnish Literature Society that was founded already in the 1830s. And also the collection that we heard about earlier this morning, Elias Lönnroth's collection of Kalevala poetry, was also a very, very big sort of point of source of pride and inspiration also for Swedish speakers in Finland. So already in 1886, sort of 1 year after the founding of the society, there are scholarships in place for folklore collectors to sort of traverse the Swedish-speaking regions of Finland. And this was had quite a high level of ambition, this collection project. And so in order for these collections to be actually accepted, they needed to be approved by a folklore committee, and they needed to be accompanied by a travelogue, a sort of fieldwork diary. And I want to just quickly to show you an excerpt from one of these diaries. It's from the student Janne Thurman, who made a collection tour in 1890. He writes, "On the 27th of September, I left the villages, accompanied by the memory of a warm welcoming. The inhabitants and I had during our long time together become friends. They gave me their vernacular, their fairy tales, while in the evening I told them about events from the history of the fatherland, events from the world outside. If only the work will be good, so that the fine gentlemen will be pleased, were the last words that reached my ears as I walked away with my pack." I think you find this rather familiar sounding, right? Because it's very much in the genre of anthropological writing, depicting then sort of the natives here as living isolated in this bubble beyond civilization. But it also says something about the gap between the countryside population and these fine gentlemen in Helsinki. And the collector here acts as the cultural broker, bridging both these worlds. So the collection work had additional aspects, that of educating and informing people of the larger cause of preserving Swedish-speaking culture in Finland. And this was very active work. The collector Henrik Ståhl notes already in 1889 in his fieldwork diary that people in northern Österbottnia were very familiar with ethnographic work due to the many collectors who had previously traversed the region. And then 17 years later, in 1916, in a different part of Swedish-speaking Finland, the young female collector Vivi Peters writes that people were already on board and that she was met by happy faces. There was a belief that folklore was about to disappear forever under the pressure of modernization and urbanization, hence the great haste in collecting. As it was believed that there was a definite amount of valuable folklore out there, it was seen as a feasible task to collect it all. And definitely covering all of the Swedish-speaking areas in Finland. This was also kind of like an inventory of what kind of Swedish folk culture was out there. And this active and very physical work also, traveling around the countryside, had some side effects in drawing people into a sphere of interest. It was in fact a performance of importance. So there was kind of an emerging, albeit rather idealistic, sense of community forming. Already in the beginning of the 1900s, they had accumulated quite large collections, and there was an ambition to publish this collected material. The head of the folklore committee explicitly expressed that the archive material was not to lie on the shelves and just collect dust. It should be possible to access widely. And this was done through the large publication project, Finlands Svenska folkdiktning, Finland's Swedish folk poetry. And while many of these volumes were then aimed at researchers, some, like the volumes with fairy tales and folk music, also became popular with the general public. Now, jumping forward a few decades, in line with what was happening in other Nordic countries, in the Baltic countries, and indeed in Ireland, was also part of this sphere. The Archives of Folk Culture was founded in the Society of Swedish-speaking Literature in 1937, as a way of making the work with collection more sort of professional, more scientific, and more systematic. And this, I think, shows also how important this international network for archives actually were. They were all aware of each other, they were copying each other, were learning from each other, they had close contact working together. And so it's very, very, I have to say, almost moving for me to be here today and see that this is still so very important in our field. So during this period also, the Swedish Literature Society started to use questionnaires in a more systematic ways. And I should perhaps point out now also that this Archives of Folk Culture, that name was done away with in 2015. And we're now sort of just the collections of language and tradition under the roof of SLS Archives, which, well, let's face it, is a rather anonymous and perhaps not the most enticing of names, but nevertheless. So these archives were sent out to a network of respondents, and these respondents often acted as spokespeople for the region, and very often they also carried out small fieldworks, walking around and interviewing local elders before composing their answers. And these respondents were very loyal to this network. Some of them responded every single questionnaire for many, many decades. And it was also common with quite close contacts between the archivists and these network contributors, with correspondence, and they knew about family members and asked also personal questions in these letters. Now, in recent years, and now we're up to our days here, this network has withered away, and the remaining contributors that we have are very much on the elderly side. And since it's not being added to, the network will disappear in the near future, and we have not yet found a way to replace it. Another point is that today, the web questionnaires that we use today have changed the character of the replies. The answers tend to be much shorter and not so elaborate as the previous handwritten answers. And I know that different archives have different experiences on this with web questionnaires, but this is from our perspective. And moreover, there's no real personal contact anymore between the archivists and the people that respond to the web questionnaires. We hope in the future, again looking at some of our sister archives here, perhaps to introduce a web platform for questionnaires and collection, where people can create their own profiles. And then perhaps we could have a semblance of some kind of online community, but we're not there yet. So what points of contact do we then have with the general public, and how do we promote accessibility today? Well, we have, of course, our what we call customer service, and note the word customer. These are then the researchers, the people that come to us looking for archive material and most often sit in our reading room, or nowadays increasingly, especially after the pandemic, we can also serve them through sending digitalized material through email. And this group, the people that come are sort of researchers. It's been fairly consistent for quite a long time. They're mainly academic researchers, but also a large group of local historians, amateur researchers, authors, some journalists, although journalists don't generally take the time to sit and swift through a lot of our archive material. They want us to give them the answers. And then also people looking for material regarding their own families or their home region. And we're trying very much also to reach new groups through being active in social media, through archive pedagogics for school children, and very importantly, making digitalized material available through the Finnish search portal Finna, and through creating digital products, such as the web version of all the volumes of Finland's svenska folkdiktning, the Finland's Swedish folk poetry. And I have no time to go into talking about this online resource, but my colleague Pia Lindholm, who sits over there, she is the single woman power behind this. And especially the folk music volumes are very, very interesting. Please talk to Pia about this. So digitization is, without a shadow of a doubt, an amazing tool to make material accessible. But, and this is sort of really my big point here, we also need to make people aware that the material is there and that it might be of interest to them. And then another sort of side point to this is also when we have these mass digitalization projects, it's really important when we put material out there just to be available to make sure that the metadata and the context is also accessible. Because, I mean, there might lead to very serious misunderstandings if for some reason you don't have this information. And also we have to be a bit careful that all folklore collections doesn't become purely cabinets of curiosities. So the emphasis we have at my workplace on digitizing the archive has meant that, or it means actually, that we as archivists spend most of our time in front of the computer screens, not very accessible in terms of personal contacts. And that's why I think it's really important for us that we make the most of all stages of the archive process, also the collection and the sort of planning of collections stage. And fieldwork is something that perhaps our management is not too keen on. It takes time and resources, and it might make perfect sense just to focus only on collection via the digital questionnaire. And this is, of course, also perfectly fine, but I feel that doing so would be losing out on something very important, a lost opportunity to connect with people in their own environments. And different types of documentation projects are an opportunity to gain visibility for the archive and to connect with potentially new groups of users. And I want to just very briefly here at the end take an example from a recent fieldwork that we're doing. And indeed, the two pictures there to the right of my colleagues Lisa and Yrsa are from this project. And it's an interview project on amateur theatre. And this has been a really wonderful project to work with because we have usually the web questionnaires with just one archivist is responsible for one questionnaire. But here we actually collaborated between a group of 4 colleagues. And we also have used a big scope of different documentation methods, questionnaires, interviews, sort of online fieldwork and fieldwork in situ at the places, and used video camera and fieldwork notations, etc., etc. And another reason why it's been so rewarding is that this is amateur theatre is a phenomenon that's hugely popular all over Swedish-speaking Finland. So here we've been visiting also at least I think 8 or 9 different places so far in different regions of the Swedish-speaking areas in Finland. And moreover, amateur theatre is something that really engages from sort of really young children to quite old people. So we get this great scope of demographics, and also people from all walks of life can be engaged in amateur theatre, and it sort of brings up a lot of themes of oral history, of community, identity, language issues, dialect, etc. So incredibly important. And one point here that I'm really quite strangely pleased about is that so many of the people we have met have absolutely no clue what SLS Archive is about, what it is, that it exists. But here, quoting then, or paraphrasing, I should say, the young female collector Vivi Peters, we have consistently been met by happy faces. So it's this, we have a common interest, and now they know that there is such an archive as SLS Archives. And I also wanted to make a point connecting to the wonderful keynote by Anne Gillian about how things, sometimes you get this positive loop when you put things out there, when you do things, And I think this has been also something that we see in doing fieldwork and meeting people. Sometimes you get surprising things back. A few years, I think it was 5 years ago, we did a quite large collection project on LBT, I can't remember the combination of letters in English, LBTQ plus communities. And now, just recently, we've been contacted by a small, well, I just call them queer society on the Åland Islands, who wanted to collaborate with us and do an oral history project, which we have no resources whatsoever to do this, and we're so happy about them trusting us to take this material. And also some of the theatre companies that we work with are also contacted us and said that, would you be willing to take, we have hours and hours of taped oral history interviews, would you be interested? So this feels sort of especially rewarding. That I get to my end point here now. That I think this conference title of Tradition and Variation is absolutely wonderful, and I think it's also key to how tradition archives should work. A big yes, of course, to new methods and embracing ways to make archive material more accessible through digital means, but also remember to be accessible as archivists and to invite to the co-creation of material, and also take model from smaller community archives that might not have the resources to do large-scale digitizing, but have this amazing passion and working ways to actually connect and engage with communities. And I think it comes down to this with access, to have it on each level of the archive work, and also that it's sort of connected to this question of trust and being worthy of trust. So, thank you very much.